Welcome to Net Zero Week 2026 and to this special fireside chat. And I'm delighted to be joined by Joe Gilroy from Balfour Beatty, who is the Group Sustainability Director. I'm looking forward to some very interesting discussion about all things net zero. Joe, we've spent years talking about setting targets. What's the conversation around net zero now?
Great question, Andy. So the conversation around net zero now is a rapid shift from setting the targets to actually taking action on the ground. And if we're being honest, the gap between those two things in the industry, it is quite large. We've got some big hurdles to overcome. We're very good at the target setting. A lot of organizations are, but how that translates down into practical, tangible, and critically scalable actions on the ground is the challenge.
So, what are the hardest parts of moving from setting net zero targets to delivery on the ground?
One word: money, and the flow of money to the right places. So we have now, as an industry, we're crossing over from being in that place where we can enjoy the low-hanging fruits. There's efficiency gains to be had. We're starting to come to the end of the road on those efficiency gains, and we've now got to tip over into the blended space of, yep, we've got to keep driving efficiency, but we've also got to invest and start to make the markets around the technologies that we are going to need. For some of these technologies, you're not talking about small sums of money. We need new infrastructure in order to start to use alternative fuels, such as hydrogen, such as some of the biodiesels that are coming onto the marketplace. And it's not a quick fix. You can't just flick a switch and it's done. So we need to have a real sort of systems approach where we have the right policies in place to unlock funding, the right expectations placed on the industry, the right targets set by client, the right buy-in from the supply chain, and the money fundamentally needs to flow all the way down in order for us to deliver those innovations on the ground.
You mentioned systems there,
Mm.
and system leadership. How much of that whole challenge is actually within the industry's control to sort out?
Oh, again, a really good question. One of the really big challenges around trying to decarbonize a business is you're trying to grab hold of something that is really complicated and really big. And it's very difficult for people to really know what practical, tangible action they can take on the ground. And you've probably heard it, Andy. People often say, oh, I understand it's important, but what difference can I make? This is where we need to have, people need to understand that small change that they make on the front line. So, the decision to invest in or employ, I should say, a piece of energy efficient kit, that decision to turn the lights off, that decision to recycle, that decision to, design the project to be as sustainable as possible. All of those decisions actually add up to that bigger systems approach. So organizations have to play their part. The complexity and the scale of the challenge is not an excuse not to take action. But I feel at the moment we're getting too hung up on this narrative of it's too big, it's too complicated, what change, what difference can I really make? Instead of focusing on actually one small change will gravitate outwards and start to make big differences down the line. And I think this is where we need to apply that systems thinking, but at the local level. I think if we get too stuck in systems thinking, at the macro level, everybody's going to get a little bit lost again.
I think in many ways, what you're probably talking about there to a certain extent is leadership, and lots of organizations obviously talk about net zero. So, what separates the leaders then from the followers?
I would say it's a willingness to have the difficult conversations and the willingness to hold their hands up and say, this is really hard. We don't have all the answers, and we're having a go, and we're experimenting and we're innovating. And that means that some of the things that we're going to do are going to work, we're going to nail it, we're going to roll them across business, but other things we're going to have a go at, and they're not going to work, but we're going to learn from intelligent failure. So the leadership piece, it is that willingness to have the challenging conversations, because we must remember, and this is a really important point that I want to make, we're not trying to achieve net zero in isolation. We are trying to achieve sustainable development and sustainable growth. Now, why are they different? As Balfour Beatty, or any business actually, we can be net zero tomorrow. No problem whatsoever. We can do it with actually probably moderate amount of effort and a very little amount of money. We can do it. Does not mean that we are sustainable in any shape or form. And if we just focus on net zero and we don't look at it in the context of how are we trying to create sustainable development, sustainable growth in a way that is a just and fair transition for everybody, we're going to deviate down a path that isn't going to fix the climate crisis. So I think that's a really important narrative shift that we have to make on the net zero agenda as we're starting to move from focusing on our targets to focusing on practical action on the ground. If we're investing in a solution on the ground, a new technology, a new process, a new way of working that is low carbon, that causes other unsustainable impacts in the supply chain, either up or down of us, it is not the right decision.
So how do you know then whether you are making that real progress on the ground rather than just simply improving numbers on a sheet of paper?
So I think it comes down to a couple of things. Firstly, having solutions that you've done the full sustainable assessment and you've weighed in the balance what are the pros, the cons, and the trade-offs, right? There's no ultimate sustainable solution today. You're always going to have to make a trade-off. So the first thing is being really honest and clear about those things so that you know the solution in question, all right, it's driving value in one area, but it might be eroding value in another area. So you've got to make that visible because you've got to fix that as part of your sustainable trajectory as a business. So the first thing is that honest assessment of the true sustainable value, or whole life value, as some people say. The next is having a solution that isn't just a one-hit wonder. It's not something that just sits on one project in one area. It is something that can be scaled across a business. And it's something that suppliers can grab hold of, customers can grab hold of. And the third one is culture. And we actually don't talk enough about this because at the center, we can set policy, we can bring on board new technologies, we can bring on board new processes. But if the individual on the front line doesn't engage with that tool and decide at that critical moment to take a sustainable low carbon action versus an unsustainable action, then it's not going to work. You can sit at the center with all of your tools and your toolkit indefinitely. So I think part of the success criteria is how far have we shifted the culture? Does the workforce understand it's important, it's a non-negotiable, and it's how we do business? And that's actually something that the construction industry historically has done brilliantly with health and safety. It's a non-negotiable. It's how we go to work. And we have to apply that same mentality to the climate crisis, the net zero agenda, and fostering sustainable growth.
Just coming back to this question of trade-offs, do you think that the industry is honest enough about the trade-offs involved in getting to net zero?
No. Because I think we're too busy competing on net zero. And really, an organization's sustainable credentials, they are part of the tender process, for a client, sell them to us. And that's all very well and good. But really, we should be selling our sustainable credentials at the business qualifying stage. So we don't even get to bid for work until we demonstrate and explain how we are able to advance the sustainable agenda within our business. The problem for me is, that discussion happens at the business winning stage. So it becomes a point of competition. And at that point, you're not going to have the honest conversations. You're not going to say, hey, we're working on hydrogen. There's some brilliant wins with hydrogen. It's got fantastic application. The trade-off is, right, we've got, the space requirements on a site. Okay, we've got to look at that. We don't currently manufacture hydrogen in the UK at scale. That's a barrier to progress. So we're less likely to have these more honest conversations. So we need to shift that discussion around the competition landscape to business qualifying and take it out of business winning, in my humble opinion.
How do we get there though? Because you're talking there about a shift from what's happening at the moment to what you say should be happening. How do we actually get people to change their outlook in that area?
This is where it comes down to leadership and sending the signals to the market to say this is how it should be done. And I do feel that because of Balfour Beatty's position in the industry, our size and our scale, we are in a quite a unique position to make the markets around changes that need to happen, not just changes in terms of infrastructure, again, new products, new processes, but also paradigm shifts that need to happen in order for us to really move forward on the net zero and the climate agenda and have those honest conversations. I mean, a really good example of an honest conversation, and I don't know if you've seen it, Andy, but I think it was in 2021, Oxfam produced a report called Tightening the Net, because a lot of organisations, as part of their net zero targets, they have an offsetting target or a percentage of their carbon they're prepared to offset. Do you know that if the developed world was to meet their 2050 net zero obligations by offsetting, do you know that we would have to replant with trees an area 5 times the size of the Indian continent? That's literally the equivalent of all the farming land on the planet today, 1.6 billion hectares. And yet we're still talking about offsetting as if it's a viable solution, as if trees are this magical carbon sequestrators, which they're not actually. They're brilliant for biodiversity, but when it comes to sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, they're actually not that efficient.
So maybe we need to look beyond carbon then.
Absolutely.
And, in your view, has this whole debate around net zero become too narrow then?
Absolutely. We've got tunnel vision on it. And where we need to look beyond, biodiversity. And I go back to, we can be net zero tomorrow, does not mean we are sustainable. If we are driving solutions that are low carbon, but are creating biological, environmental damage in the supply chain, that is defeating the purpose. The planet is designed to regulate a temperature that is conducive to life. And if we are eroding and destroying those natural support systems, so water systems, nutrient flow systems, forestry systems, coral reef systems, if we're destroying these systems, then we can be low carbon all day long. We are not going to avert climate change, because as we are, if you like, improving one side of the scale, we're tipping down the other. There's a lot of real sort of thought leaders in this space that really do understand and are trying to elevate the fact that the environmental crisis in terms of the loss of biodiversity, the loss of species habitat, the loss of umbrella species is actually more of a crisis than the net zero agenda. And we have to look at both. If we then go back to what you said about competition, this is the problem where competition comes in, because we might have a low carbon solution, but it's creating that biodiversity damage. This is why we took the stance against HVO, because it's not clear cut today whether the manufacture of the feedstock for HVO creates biodiversity loss somewhere in the supply chain. It's so opaque that we can't dig into it and ask a simple question such as, where does that feedstock come from? How has it been grown? What impact has it had? And this was something else that the Oxfam report actually highlighted, that if we don't start to really dig into the detail and get transparency over supply chains, and we focus on the wrong solutions, if we end up driving low carbon solutions that compromise food production, the developed world could drive up the cost of food in developing nations by 80%. So, we've said, I'll go back to, we've got to be honest about the trade-offs. There's no easy solution, there's no quick win, got to be transparent about it.
So how much of this is about learning new things versus applying what we already have at our disposal and what we already know?
So it's definitely both. So, what we already know, we know how to be efficient. We just have to get on with it. Efficient with energy, efficient with materials, efficient with people's time, driving productivity, optimization, all of these things are part of the sustainability pie, if you like. So we have to keep our foot on that gas pedal. What we already know, we're not good at making that consistent, so we have to push on that. But it is also about adopting new technologies and new ways of working. And I think, you know, hydrogen fuel, for example, is such an interesting new market entrant. You know, we've got really exciting work going on with some of our suppliers on how we can use hydrogen to make energy fundamentally more accessible in the remote areas where we're building. And the wonderful thing about hydrogen is it can be manufactured from multiple different sources. You know, it's a great power source, and I think it's going to be part of the mix. But again, one of the things we must be careful on hydrogen about is it's not going to be the Hail Mary solution. It's not going to be a one size fits all. I think, you know, the construction sites of the future are going to have multiple different sources of energy. And this is the new learning that's got to come about, particularly in relation to low carbon. You know, the industry has grown up and been very successful on the back of a single fuel, diesel. But, you know, there's a good saying currently at the moment, which is to be reliant on diesel is to gamble on geopolitics. So there's a really sound business case around diversifying your energy use as well as a low carbon one. But the construction side of the future is going to move from a single source of fuel to multiple. You're going to have solar, wind, battery, hydrogen, biofuels. It's about looking at what are we trying to build, what's the right energy source for the right bit of kit, and making those decisions at the design stage and at the point that we're looking to mobilize the site as well.
Turning to something that you mentioned earlier, and that's money, and particularly value.
My favourite subject, Andy.
Value versus cost always comes up in all aspects of business, not just net zero. So what, in your view, has to change if we want low carbon solutions to become the default, the norm, rather than the exception?
It's the triple bottom line. So, you know, on a business's P&L, it's cash. You know, money in, money out. We have to also now start to account for environmental value and social value, because, you know, every business on the planet, regardless of what they do, it doesn't matter what they sell or where they work or their geography or, you know, the customer base that they're trying to tap into, they all rely on natural resources in order to be in business, either directly or somewhere in their supply chain. If those resources aren't there anymore, they do not have a business. It has value. And it's the same for societal value. Every business, you've got to have people that want to work for you, supply to you, and buy from you. If you don't have that, you don't have a business. You know, and when we talk about that environmental value piece, let's now focus down on construction. You know, what is our biggest source of environmental value today? So arguably so. So if I said to you it didn't exist anymore, Andy, we would be in trouble. What material do you think I'm talking about? Have a guess.
Water.
Water, great one. People normally go for water, they normally go for or fuel, or they'll go for concrete, or they'll go for steel, etc. Sand. So sand is in nearly everything around construction, either as a raw material or as a direct product. It's also finite. It's a finite resource because it's not just any sand, it's actually a very particular type of sand that we need. That has value, but the value of that raw material, that product that is finite, is not recognized on a balance sheet. We've got to have environmental value and social value on the balance sheet, because that way, you know, decision makers and business leaders can actually take decisions that say, right, if I pull this lever, what happens to my profit? What happens to my environmental value? What happens to my social value? And see if they actually like the output of that equation. Is that equation sustainable, or does that equation actually potentially compromise my business in 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, 36 months down the line? So it's got to be on the balance sheet, and it can be done. You know, the triple bottom line is not a new concept.
So kind of flowing from that a little bit, affordability and delivery, how do we balance pace, ambition, and also affordability in all of this? I mean, it seems like it's quite a difficult one to crack.
It is quite a difficult one to crack. But again, if we're being honest with ourselves, we get very excited, don't we, about the new shiny product on the marketplace. So it is about consistency around, we found a new solution, a new product. So it could be hydrogen, it could be a biofuel, it could be, another energy source, for example, solar, you name it, or a new process that drives optimization, productivity, etc. But we have to be consistent. We have to really focus on that and embed it in the business consistently, and not get distracted necessarily by the new shiny market entrant. That doesn't mean we don't keep an eye on those things and we have exploratory conversations, but it mustn't come at the cost of consistently embedding new ways of working, new technologies across an entire business and across every project. Because as soon as we start to do that, we increase demand, increase supply, and that brings the cost down for everybody. And then everybody can start to benefit as well. We have to unlock those markets so that everyone can participate and have access to the technologies that are needed. So I think it is a tricky equation to balance cost versus pace, but I think there is a balance to be struck there if we focus on integrating solutions across an entire business and across an entire project portfolio.
I want to come back to industry leadership, because I think everyone would accept that we live in interesting times, both domestically, internationally, right across the board. So from your perspective, what does leadership look like when maybe there isn't a clear roadmap to basically guide us on our way? What does leadership look like in that respect?
Oh, yeah, brilliant question, Andy. So I think leadership in that situation is courageous is the word. Courageous and honest. So you have to be willing, as a sustainability professional, you are fundamentally an agent for change. And that means you have to be prepared to be the odd one out in the room, to be the one, again, whether it's an organization or an individual, putting your hand up and saying, is this the right way? Can we do this better? Are we making decisions based on one element of a very complicated equation? Can we do better? And it is that courage to do that, because it is challenging. Again, from an organizational perspective or from an individual perspective, it is a lot to say to somebody, can you be the outsider? Can you be the odd one out? Can you be the disruptor? But then also the leadership has got to be honest. And we go back to what we spoke about, those honest conversations, and not give the impression that this is easy, or that it's not going to be done without money, without investment. And finally, resilience, because so much of this sustainable development journey that we're on, and this net zero journey that we're on, so much of it is actually going to be grounded in the mistakes that we make and the learnings that we get from things that we try that don't work. And we have to embrace a bit of what Thomas Edison had when he was asked by a journalist. He just invented the light bulb. He was at a press conference, and he was asked by a journalist, Mr. Edison, how did you keep going when you failed to make a light bulb 278 times? And he said, I didn't fail. I found 278 ways not to make a light bulb. And we have to have that mentality.
So you talk about bravery, and you talk about sort of the industry sort of standing up. Is the sector vocal enough with politicians, with opinion formers, with people who are actually making the decisions?
Absolutely. And the industry's got a proud history of that. We have an extensive history of working very collaboratively with government, both as part of their, industry discussion forums, their round tables. We do a lot of work with our supply chain as well. We work with them through the Sustainability Supply Chain School and through our own forums that we pull together. Those historical conversations have borne fruit today. I mean, look at, again, the safety agenda being such a good example. That was bold conversations with government, says we need stronger policy, we need empowerment around this, and conversations with our clients around everybody deserves to go home safe. We're simply looking for the next iteration of that around the sustainability agenda. But that is something that the construction industry is very good at and not shy of at all.
So looking ahead then, if people look back in 10 years' time, what will distinguish the organisations that have genuinely led the transition?
They're going to be more profitable. So they're going to have greater market share. They're going to be more profitable. They're going to have young people wanting to work for them. So, you know, the employment crisis that's currently going on in construction, they won't be suffering from that because young people will be voting with their most important chip, which is their man, woman, and non-binary power, their willingness to work for those organizations. They will be more profitable. And so, you know, and they will have made investments now for a more profitable future. And those businesses will carry less risk for investors. They'll be more resilient. They'll have a greater diversity of portfolio as well. So, you know, because it's not just about addressing the climate crisis, which is critically important. Businesses need to realize that in doing that, you are going to secure the future profitability of your business. Sustainable growth will bring about business resilience and vice versa. So that will be the distinguishing factor, I think.
Sustainable growth, successful businesses, happy staff, happy workers. I think that's a really good message. Jo Gilroy, thank you very much indeed.
No worries. Thank you so much, Andy.